All right. Welcome for the second reading of How Jesus and His Followers Saved Civilization. A fascinating read we began last week. For those who missed it, I recommend checking out the recording in the description box to the last week's, both the reading, but also the discussion during and also after the reading. It's a long essay written in 1980. I think everyone here has everyone here who's on live had a chance to either listen to the recording or I recognize a lot of people from last week. So did anybody miss? Actually, let me ask it this way. Did anybody not experience last week's reading in any way? All right.
I did not. I just keyed into this today.
All right, Dan, you're hopping on. Okay. I think it was Caroline. Was it Caroline or who was it who said they were going to go through a recap? I forget.
I volunteered to do a recap.
Oh, it was you. Okay. All right. So
I don't know if Caroline did or not.
I'm not going to put you on the spot, Nathan, because it seems like everybody here has what experienced last week. But if you want to do a brief, whatever comes to memory, that's fine.
Be your picture.
Well, I kind of do, but I can't. I wrote down stuff because I didn't feel comfortable just speaking off the. I didn't understand it enough to be able to just speak spontaneously, But I would have wanted to highlight a few things.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. Oh, well, it was just recapping that there's two opposing or different views points. One that we were made in the image of a loving God, just to what you were talking about last week, and then there's an obsessive agenda to prosecute a new religion, or rather a rehashing of dark Elysian mystery cults that we see people. Not neighbors driving trucks. See people not as creative and beautiful, but as slaves and animalistic machines to be exploited, mocked, and controlled. For we battle not against flesh and blood, but against princedoms and powers, against rulers of darkness, against wickedness in high places. St. Paul, Ephesians 6:12. The Roman system offered little innovation, and it was just a kind of an exploitive. The economic system was pretty much like it is today in the West, the Roman system, where they had to just expand and exploit peoples because they weren't creative, and they didn't emphasize the creative potential of people, individuals, but rather they were degenerate in having to almost parasitize new and exploit different cultures and expand that way because they were rotting from within. So the Roman system was ruled by perverted cults that offered castration and sacrifice of bulls and such. And orgies and bacchanalia characterized the Roman elite. Temples were also the banks, and the military enforced the will of the temple. And the military. Can everybody hear me? Because there's a few cars coming by.
Yeah.
The military.
I don't hear any cars.
Oh, good. The military itself was controlled by the Mithraic cults, and what it was is Christianity reintroduced Platonic teachings through St. Paul, St. John, and Philo of Alexandria. It sought to transubstantiate peasants and citizenry in harmony with Platonic ideals of reason and logos, to establish via Jesus of Nazareth, to bring about the kingdom of heaven, and by Jesus, logos, and God available, make it with Jesus, logos, and God available to the people. I and them, and thou and me, that they may be made perfect in one. Each person through logos has a responsibility to expand order, virtue, and ethics, creating a society and culture that thrives in creativity, productivity, inventiveness, innovation, and industry. Logos, ideas of ideas, hypothesis of higher hypothesis. In this way, Christianity entered into a political fray by making Jesus, a logos, available to the people, and it transformed what basically was, through the diaspora of Jewish peoples and the previous Judaic religion and ruled by the law of Moses, or thou shalt not. It was resolved in the law of Moses of love. And so social political order was determined by reason. And this is a principle of Republican constitution based on natural law, ethics, and virtue. And so Christianity introduced not something necessarily new, a new myth, like a new drugs for the people, new stories for the people, but it transformed the previous Old Testament into an allegorical form that was extremely Platonic, and it brought the old teachings of Platoism that were truly necessary during the decline of the Roman Empire that was just rotten. So yeah, so and let's see, then there was this Aristotelian emergence. Once Platonic thought started taking over, started getting stronger through Christianity and the Renaissance, you saw a flowering of innovation with a lot of artists and culture and inventions. And this is all based on the Platonic knowledge and Platonic teachings. But there was, of course, an Aristotelian line of thing that sort of sought to emphasize only the emanations, but not even that, really, just focusing fully on the senses and what we can, on the physical and the materialistic science. And that sort of has dominated, but that too is a cult, as has been revealed. And in our times, this is so relevant today because we're seeing a reintroduction and a grasping of new stories that are really just rehashings of the old drug cults and mysteries that were going on in ancient Greek times, and probably since the time of the comets, darn it, when Billy walked out of his cave and whatever. I mean, it's been going a long time. So they're just trying to reintroduce trauma to control people, fear, sacrifice, and they're very satanic, and they're really just projecting their own dark selves onto people and not seeing the creative potentials that each person has. That's extremely powerful and it's the only way forward. And it's a beautiful thing about humanity. Okay.
I think that did justice to last week's reading, and that was pretty good. Yeah. Okay. If anybody wants to add a thought to that before we jump in, I would say one thing: Philo of Alexandria was introduced as a very important personality who is going to play a much bigger role in the story. The stage has been set, as Nathan went through very nicely. The mystery cults. A variety of very important ones, Mithridates, a few others, Cybele, were introduced. They're going to also be reintroduced and will continue to play a role during the story that will emerge through the period of Rome's conversion from a republic into an empire. I would say one thing: I would like it if this author had spent a little bit more time or was a bit more sensitive to the moral collapse of Rome as a republic, from a republic to an empire, which he wasn't that sensitive to, but that's okay. And like I said last week, don't treat anything that's being said today as if it's the gospel final truth on everything. But this is a very, very solid approach, analysis, with a sensitivity to the geopolitical realities and structure of both conspiracies and the battle of ideas around principled concepts of God, human nature, natural law, that have been shaping the past 2,000 plus years. So I really, really encourage people who are listening online, especially the recording, to read the paper and get a sense of what were these cults, because as Nathan just said, there's a direct continuity to a lot of these dominant cults that organize these wars, the wars between Rome and Carthage, and so many other devastating, disruptive effects throughout history, and today's system, the same network of dark forces controlling or attempting to try to corral the world once more. So it's a direct continuity. It's not like something kind of parallel or kind of similar. It's a direct continuity, but with new packaging, new branding. So let's jump in. Share. So I guess from a We need a reader as usual, either one or more readers. We'll start with if somebody's in the zone and feeling like they're doing a good job reading and everyone's loving it, we'll just keep that one reader. If we want to, change batons, we could do that too. So maybe we could start with the last discussion, I think, was on the Philo's intervention on being political and how to be truly a moral, spiritual being requires that people be political beings as well, and not dichotomize their spiritual world from the material world that they live in. That was the last thing we discussed in the paper. So maybe we could start here with in the purest sense. So who would like to be today's first reader?
I'll try. My connection is good.
Sure.
Okay. In the purest sense, the followers of Philo, like the followers of Jesus Christ, had formed a political party. With them, Philo had created an entirely new concept of nationality. For the first time, the idea of a nation was based on the adherence of its citizens to a system of ideas. No longer was nationality based on territory or race or tribe, but on a brotherhood of common belief. The idea of humanism, as presented by the pre-Socratic Ionian philosophers, systematized by Plato and elaborated by Philo, forged the common bond for the citizens of the kingdom of God. As that notion took root in even broader circles in the... Okay, how do I get rid of the little boxes of pictures? Oh, I think I did it. Can I have the previous sentence?
As that notion
Little
took root.
higher.
Okay.
As that notion took root in even broader circles in the Mediterranean, I believe. A little lower.
A little lower.
In the Mediterranean elite and in the population at large, a new nation, universal in scope, would be born within the decaying society of the Roman Empire. The seed crystal for an everlasting empire, founded on Rome's ruins, was in place. The first partisans of Philo's movement were known as the Allegoricists, as opposed to the literalists that Philo was so fond of ridiculing. Decisively, Philo had split the Jewish community around his idea. It is probable that the widely traveled Philo had been to Jerusalem several times and developed collaborators there. The centrist idea of Jewish unity had been demolished, and the cultist Jews were now opposed by a faction demanding a humanist revolution. Philo contemptuously called the Pharisees, Sadducees, and their ilk citizens of a petty state, referring to their fanatical attachment to Jerusalem, while he described his faction as those on the roll of citizens of a greater country, namely this whole world. The term that Philo used to describe this whole world was megalopolis, the one great city. For Philo, the entire universe was like a single city, governed by reason and natural law, the logos. Individual states and kingdoms necessarily were merely a subordinate feature of this natural law, and their authority is thus derived nowhere but from God. This was the Mosaic state whose establishment was the task of Philo's partisans, who must act to bring civilization into harmony with natural law. Philo drew upon the prevalent messianic tradition of the Jews to suggest that salvation would occur when a great teacher, leader would emerge to found the kingdom of God. But Philo was explicit about his belief that such a leader would also be prepared to wage political warfare as well as epistemological debate, and that the Mosaic state, the just and true republic, could be founded on earth as the symbol of human progress. This was Philo's conception of the kingdom of God. It embodied the Platonic axiom of perfection. At the time, the notion of perfection did not exist as an active concept. The Roman elite was in the grip of the pseudo-intellectual Stoic tradition, whose dulling assumptions about a static and unchanging universe were the hallmark of Roman political thought. Philo's revolutionary view of political history is best highlighted in comparison with that of the famous Stoic historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before Christ. According to Polybius, history, especially political history, operates in cycles. The rise and fall of great empires, evident throughout history, was to Polybius just a sign that whatever man could raise up would be eventually destroyed and turned to ruins. Small states could become great. Great states could pass through evolutionary changes from monarchy to aristocracy to democracy, but they are all fated to disintegrate inexorably. In turn, the great empire would be replaced by another and another, with each suffering in turn the same unhappy fate. In the words of Polybius, this is the cycle of political revolutions, the course appointed by nature, in which constitutions change, disappear, and finally return to the point from which they started. This was the Stoic theory of cycles. Stoics believed in the existence of a great year. The great year was the length of a cycle, during which history was fated to repeat itself. At the end of the great year, the whole course of history would simply be repeated like a television rerun, again and again. The Stoics industriously even managed to calculate the exact length of the great year, namely 30,000 seasons. They derived this figure from the supposed cycle of the known planets. It was thought to be the length of time required for the planets, given any initial configuration, to return exactly to that configuration again, given their differing periods of revolution. To this period, Polybius would say, corresponded the cycle of political revolutions. For Polybius, the decline and fall of Rome is inevitably written. It should be remembered that Polybius was writing at the very height of Rome's glory, following its victory in the last of the Punic Wars, when Carthage was utterly crushed. Yet Polybius predicts Rome's collapse. Oh, where am I?
Hold on 1 second. Sorry.
There we go. In a brilliant stroke, Philo demolished such gibberish. For Philo, the world's evolution had direction, a divine plan. The logos, or creative reason, was the primary determinant of historical evolution and the rise and fall of cities. Blind fate has no role. Writes Philo, for circle-wise moves the divine logos, which the majority of men call fortune. Presently, in its ceaseless flux, it makes distribution city by city, nation by nation, country by country. What all had, all have. Only from time to time is the ownership changed by its agency, to the end that the whole of our world should be as a single state, enjoying that best of all constitutions, democracy. Thus, for Philo, what the majority of men call fate or fortune does not account for the concept of progress, in which the universe, governed by the logos, moves toward perfection, provided men are taught to live according to the Mosaic law, then the end result will be a messianic age. which Philo called an everlasting dominion, which shall never pass away. This will be the kingdom of God. The importance of Philo's assertion may require some explanation. To posit the existence of the idea of progress is not quite self-evident. Today, our belief in the existence of progress, which, except for some virulent neo-Malthusians, is universal among the citizens of the American Republic, is grounded in the proven validity of the application of mind to the development of technology to improve the social level of human reproduction. With several thousand years of recorded history to view in retrospect, only a fool could ignore the real and tangible evidence of immense progress measured, in more precise terms, in the form of per capita energy
Throughput. The amount of energy used by any given system at a given moment in time. There's an increase in over time with human beings if they're being, human.
Since that job of creation is demonstrably accomplished, the task of philosophy to determine and explain the principle by which it was accomplished is made appreciably easier. We know that progress exists. We have only to identify how and not if such progress comes about. In Philo's day, he and his co-thinkers may have had an intuitive grasp of the idea of progress, but to the uninitiated, there was precious little evidence of progress. The velocity of upward change, the speed at which the human species passed through ever higher levels of social organization, was far, far slower than today, and its perception consequently far more difficult. This underlines even more strikingly the importance of the victory of the epistemology of Philo Judaeus. Finally, once and for all, the Stoic cycle of fate was broken. One of the most exciting ideas in Philo's work, and one in which his concept of progress is explained most graphically, is his explicit descriptions of the Platonic 3 levels of consciousness. Remember Philo's chief concern, how to raise up from their bestial states the pathetic cultist masses to the level of Republican citizens. Oh boy, and isn't that our job today? Nowhere in the Roman population at the time did citizens even approach the required skills and mental creative capabilities to be philosopher kings. In this regard, Philo put forward his concept of the spiritual journey. Using allegorically the story of the flight of the Jews from Egypt across the Sinai desert to the Promised Land, Philo explains the metaphor. Egypt in the story, says Philo, represents the land of sense perception. In many of Philo's writings, Egypt was used to represent the land of corruption and evil, since it was the home of the headquarters of the cult of Isis and its sister cults. By leaving Egypt, the Jews, following Moses, that is, By leaving Egypt, the Jews, following Moses, that is, Plato, were taken through the desert, which represented self-denial and a disassociation of the self with sensual and material pleasures. The Promised Land, in this case, is the land of reason.
Yeah, just in case anybody's confused where he just said Moses, that is Plato. In the previous last week's session, the point was made that Philo wrote commentaries on the Pentateuch, and in his commentaries introduces a Platonic an analysis in helping people to read and understand what's going on with the stories of Exodus and Genesis, but especially Exodus. and really infuses very clearly a Platonic spirit into the figure of Moses to help people's minds, develop to that higher epistemological level.
Philo distinguished three stages along this holy and spiritual journey. The first archetype of man he designates the earthborn, hunters after the pleasure of the body, who represent the vast majority of the population of the empire in their animal-like states. The second archetype Philo calls the heaven-born, who are men of art and scientific learning, who are devoted to knowledge, for the heavenly portion of us is our mind. These men and women have partially assimilated the dialectic of reason. Finally, the third archetype named by Philo is the God-born, who have risen wholly above the sphere of sense perception and have been translated into the world of the intelligible and dwell there, registered as free men of the commonwealth of ideas. With poetic mastery, where'd it go? With poetic mastery, Philo at last describes the state of reason, the state of human perfection to which all mankind must aspire. In his allegorical writings, Philo gave names to the three archetypes. According to his scheme, Abraham of the Bible is the name of the earthborn man, full of unchecked passion and obedient only to the commandments and his fear of heavenly retribution. Jacob is the second, who is committed to natural philosophy. And finally, there is Isaac, whose name stands for contemplation, reason, and love. What Philo understood is the difficulty of each man to persist along the road to spiritual perfection under the temptation to return to Egypt, to the land of sensual gratification. With the reference to Plato's laws, where Plato discusses the internal war that rages within the soul of each and every individual, Philo calls this task the most difficult and oppressive of all wars. It was to assist each man in winning that war that Philo dedicated his life. As a model directly taken up by the Christians, Philo suggested that men take as their ideal becoming like unto God. This idea, directly echoing Plato, who used exactly that phrase in Theaetetus, was counterposed to the prevailing Stoic notion of following nature. The two ideas were worlds apart. In the former, man committed himself to become a creator. A shaper of destiny, a free man of the commonwealth of ideas. In the latter, men subordinated himself to the fates. We will shortly see how the ideas of Philo Judaeus spread into the Mediterranean community of Jews and interlocked with the movement of the followers of Jesus Christ, set about establishing God's kingdom. But first, we should look more closely at the Platonic logos of Philo. In a discussion of the history of Neoplatonic religion, Philo's concept of logos emerges as the cornerstone of the entire movement. In this section, we will describe in summary form the relevant aspects of that concept. Further on, we will see how the story of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ encapsulated the epistemological rigor of Philo's logos and gave rise to the Christian movement. By stressing the concept of the logos, which he also called the Son of God, Philo laid the groundwork for the powerful Christian idea of the Trinity. In that sense, Philo represents a concrete advance over the initiating work of Plato in the Timaeus. Philo's logos was the principle of creative reason, and this concept is the very heart of Philo's epistemology. Continually in his work, Philo stresses the notion of creation. Creation, in Philo's view, was a never-ending process. The cosmos was, under God's direction and under the action of the divine logos, constantly undergoing an endless process of creation and recreation. It was this idea, derived largely from the Timaeus and not from the eclectic variety of sources to which overstuffed Oxford and Cambridge scholars attribute Philo's work, that united all of Philo's work. In the key volumes devoted to creation in Philo, he sought to link the Timaeus with the Old Testament Genesis, the standard Jewish account of the world's beginning, in an attempt to harmonize the two. Philo's pen gave new life, as we shall shortly see, to the account of Moses, for Philo implanted the concept of the Logos as the driving force behind God's creation of the world. From the start, Philo's epistemology was designed to solve a problem of pedagogy that was first addressed in the Timaeus 4 centuries earlier. In that work, Plato posed the following problem. In his discussion of the creator God of reason, Plato states rather bluntly that this concept is very difficult to find, and once it is discovered, impossible to explain to everybody. Philo rejected the idea that concepts of such sublime majesty must remain the possession of only a small elite. Instead, he sought a method to communicate them to everyone. With that decision, in fact, humanist religion was born. Of course, the ability of the population to grasp the concept of reason was and is a learned skill, and the difficulties are formidable. But the cult priesthoods and the oligarchy did not allow the normal pedagogical difficulties to stand alone. Ever since the time of Plato, and even before, the cults strenuously sought to suppress and deliberately obscure the concept of creativity and reason. The priesthoods acted ruthlessly to destroy even the perception among the masses that reason and creativity exist. And where that failed, they sought to mystify the process and make it magical and fearful. Hold on, I need a drink. Sorry about that. The leading agent used to accomplish the goal of the priesthood was Aristotle. The God of Aristotle, engineered as a construct in direct opposition to the creator God of Plato's Timaeus, was the parent god of the various cults and mystery religions that swallowed Rome in the period leading up to the 1st century. Relying on sense perception rather than reason as the primary generative force behind knowledge, the pseudo-philosopher Aristotle's view was that new knowledge could never be created, but instead, man could only discover, categorize, and classify that which existed. For Aristotle, memory, the ability to hold in one's head all the mass of data collected, was the equivalent of intelligence. Aristotle's God reflected this notion. Just as knowledge could not be created or synthesized by the mind, so the universe is not the creation of God. For Aristotle, God is merely
the first cause.
bring that back down just a hair. Okay. For Aristotle, God is merely the first cause, the objective outside force that eons ago set the universe into motion and then stepped back, having nothing more to do with the evolution of the cosmos. In the Aristotelian view, God is forever distanced from the universe and from mankind. I'm sorry, that's a sad place to live. Aristotle's God, the unmoved mover, is self-contemplation. With the quintessence of remoteness, Aristotle's God exists in eternity as a mind engaged in contemplating itself, thinking itself. But this thought is a closed circle. Aristotle has removed any hint of real creative energy. Aristotle's God is self-absorbed and does not ponder the fate of anyone or anything outside itself. For the God of Aristotle, communion with a human soul is unthinkable, impossible. In fact, Aristotle does not provide any clue concerning the relationship between God, the absolute being, and the finite world. It is hardly an inspiring concept. Hear, hear. In the apt words of James Drummond in his Philo Judaeus, Aristotle's God is a lonely and self-centered consciousness toward which the world and man may wearily strive, but from which they may receive neither help nor sympathy. Aristotle's God was impotent. For Aristotle, what was important was not God, but the world. What existed and not how it came into existence was all that mattered. Philo, like Plato, did not agree. In his central work on the creation of the world according to Moses, Philo launches a direct and bitter attack on Aristotle and his followers, the Peripatetics.
Very good. Yeah.
There are some people who, having the world in admiration rather than the maker of the world, pronounce it to be without beginning and everlasting, while with impious falsehood postulate in God a vast inactivity. Whereas we ought, on the contrary, to be astonished at his powers as maker and father, and not to assign to the world a disproportionate majesty. Moses, both because he had attained the very summit of philosophy and because he had been instructed divinely in the greater and more essential part of nature's lore, could not fail to recognize that the universe must consist of two parts, one part active cause and the other passive object, and that the active cause is the perfectly pure and unsullied mind of the universe, while the passive part is in itself incapable of life and motion, but when set into motion and shaped and quickened by mind, changes into this most perfect masterpiece, namely this world. With remarkable poetic beauty, Philo here ridicules those who, like Aristotle, attribute a vast inactivity to God, and who admire the world rather than the maker of the world. But the polemical point, which is elaborated in the rest of the piece, is his emphasis on God's role as creator. In a passage that follows immediately, Philo goes on to describe that unless one asserts the existence of divine providence in guiding the daily evolution, that is, unless one assumes the real and tangible existence of progress and the process of perfection, then there exists no justification for any system of ethics. Those who assert that this world is uncreated unconsciously eliminate that which of all incentives to piety is the most beneficial and the most indispensable, namely providence. For it stands to reason that what has been brought into existence should be cared for by its father and maker. Between that which has never been brought into being and one who is not its maker, no such tie is formed. It is a worthless and baleful doctrine.
I think you have to scroll down back. I think you missed a part, Matt.
No, it is a worthless and baleful doctrine,
Okay,
setting
so
up anarchy in the well-ordered realm.
Okay, yeah. Setting up anarchy in the well-ordered realm of the world, leaving it without protector, arbitrator, or judge. As we shall shortly see, this polemic of Philo's, that little box is in the way. Can you move down just a hair? As we shall shortly see, this polemic of Philo's is directed toward the task of destroying the prevailing belief of the cult of Stoicism and its godfather, Aristotle. Philo believed passionately that the concept of progress could not be left abstract. In the decay of the Roman world, as Philo observed the descent into hell that was occurring around him, he determined that for his followers, among the elite that Philo's work created, the founding and construction of cities and new urban complexes would be the watchword for the humanist movement. Like Plato and Alexander before him, the concept of creation applied most specifically to projects of city building. In one of his most moving passages in The Creation, Philo compares the creation of the universe by God to the analogous design and construction of a magnificent city by a trained architect. In its epistemological context, the passage replicates the thrust of the Timaeus, in which Plato develops the concept of the perfect intellectual model, pattern, or idea which serves the creator in then bringing forth the sensual, ephemeral work of creation. Writes Philo, the architect first sketches in his own mind well nigh all the parts of the city that is to be wrought out: temples, gymnasia, town halls, marketplaces, harbors, docks, streets, walls to be built, dwelling houses, as well as public buildings to be set up. Thus, after having received in his own soul, as it were, in wax, the figures of these objects severally, he carries about the image of a city, which is the creation of his mind. Then, by his innate power of memory, he recalls the images of the various parts of the city and imprints their types yet more distinctly in it. And like a good craftsman, he begins to build the city of stones and timber, keeping his eye upon the patterns and making the visible and tangible objects correspond in each case to the incorporeal idea. Just such must be our thoughts about God. We must suppose that when he was minded to found the one great city, he conceived beforehand the models of its parts, and that out of these he constituted and brought to completion a world discernible only by the mind. And then, with that for a pattern, the world which our senses perceive. As therefore the city, where previously shadowed out in the mind of the man of architectural skill, had no external place, but was stamped solely in the mind of the workman, so in the same manner can the world which existed in ideas have had no other local position except the logos, divine reason, which made them. That's cool. Could somebody else take over? I think I need a cup of hot tea.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, that was a really nice reading, Susie.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
All right, who wants to pick it up?
I haven't done any
Bruce
reading for a
does.
while, Matthew.
Oh, okay, Paul.
Paul.
All right, do it.
Yeah, look, it's been fun. I was here last week and having updated, Windows 11 the night before, I get halfway through the session and my sound disappears.
Of course.
Frustrating. And this morning I had a gig last night, so I just arrived late rather. Okay, where are we up to?
The process of
The
divine
process.
reason.
Okay, sure. Let's see how I go. The process of divine reason in Philo's writing was explicitly portrayed, again, as in the Timaeus 29e, as a negenentropic one. The process of creation was the process of imposing a man-made harmony on disorder. For of itself, the world was without order, without quality, without soul. It was full of inconsistency, ill-adjustment, disharmony. But it was capable of turning and undergoing a complete change to the best, the very contrary of all these to order, quality, life, correspondence, identity, likeness, perfect adjustment, to harmony, to all that is characteristic of the more excellent model. To understand the central epistemological concepts of Philo-Judaeus, we now examine more systematically the nature of the Logos. The Logos doctrine of Philo rigorously elaborated the idea that within one generation became firmly established as the Christian Trinity. Just as in the Christian framework, Jesus Christ was the mediator between God and man, creation, so Philo's Logos served as the principle that explained the relationship between the creator and creation. In the dialogue Parmenides and elsewhere, Plato, 4 centuries earlier, has teasingly set forth a paradoxical problem. How, asked Plato, could a single undifferentiated one give rise to a multifaceted many without compromising the essential unity of the one? Interesting question, that. In other words, how can a universal idea existing of itself also have a relationship to the individual predicates that comprise the universal? Much the same question was put forward in a somewhat different form in the Timaeus, where Plato asks about the nature of the relationship of the creator God to being and becoming, to mind, to time and space, to necessity, and so forth. It is to solve this problem that Philo set forth his Logos, which he also called the idea of ideas. It is explicitly analogous to Plato's well-known hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. In Philo, the concept of the Logos as the idea of ideas is most sharply stated in the following passages on the creation. Philo begins by quoting from the Old Testament's Genesis. Oops, Daisy. Where am I?
Upper right. On which
Genesis.
on which day?
Out in the mind of the man of architect.
You went from Philo begins
Genesis, okay, yeah,
from the
okay,
Old
yeah,
Testament
right.
Genesis, and then
right side, yeah.
Yeah.
On which day God created the heaven and the earth and every green herb of the field before it appeared on the earth, and all the grass before it sprang up. Then Philo's exegesis explains his Neoplatonic interpretation of that passage. By his own supremely manifest and far-shining reason, Logos, by one command, God makes both things. The idea of mind, which, speaking symbolically, Moses calls heaven, and the idea of sense perception, which he figuratively calls earth. Never read those two being linked like that, never mind. What he means is something of this sort. As before the particular and individual mind, there subsists a certain original as an archetype and pattern of it. And again, before the particular sense perception, a certain original of sense perception related to the particular as a seal making an impression is to the form which it makes. Just so, before the individual objects of intellectual perception came into being, there was existing as a genus the intellectually perceptible itself, by participation in which the name has been given to the members of the genus. And before the individual objects of sense perception came into existence, there was, existing as a genus, the sensibly perceptible itself, by sharing in whose being all other objects of sense have become such. Before then, the particular, intellectually permissible.
Perceptible.
You'll need to go up, Matthew.
Oh.
The perceptible came into being. The creator produces the solely abstract, intellectually perceptible as a generic existence. Boy, that was a paragraph.
Yeah.
Now, let us examine. I mean, there was just a lot in there.
It's dense. It's dense, and I'm thinking that will likely be something that we will read in our Wednesday groups in the coming months. Will be Philo's work on creation. I think that'll be a good thing to unpack.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to read a whole lot like that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, my mind keeps running to Platonic forms all the time. That little paragraph was essentially describing what I understand to be Platonic forms.
Yeah.
Anyway,
absolutely.
Now let us examine the hierarchy of creation that Philo sets up here. First, above all, there is God the Creator. Then immediately beneath God is the first of God's creations, the abstract principle of mind, what Philo calls the generic intellectually perceptible itself. This is the idea of ideas, the logos or divine reason, out of which is derived the various concepts of the world of intellectual perception. Yeah, you've got to start there all right, but as soon as you take a step forward from that original initial position, the universe opens up. In effect, Philo has created the structure in which the logos bears a generic relationship to the to the so-called intelligible world. The intelligible world contains the totality of ideas, the commonwealth of imperishable and incorporeal ideas. It is the parent of the visible world. Having resolved to create this visible world of ours, he, God, first fashioned the intelligible world in order that in fashioning the physical world, he might be able to use an immaterial and godlike model, producing from this elder model a younger imitation which would contain within itself as many sensible classes of being as there were intelligible ones in the original. As above, so below. Now the intelligible world, consisting as it does of ideas, must then be the product of a mind, the mind of God. The world consisting of the ideas could have no other place than the logos of God, which ordered them, writes Philo, clearly letting mind and logos be synonymous. Then what is the act of creation? In Philo, by the act of creation, the mind logos of God generates the intelligible world, and thereby the ideas take on a real existence of their own. A basic transformation has taken place. What initially was merely a potential world has become an existent one. The idea of ideas within the mind of God has been actualized, giving birth to the intelligible world. An analogy can be drawn with the process by which an idea within the human mind, when it is actualized, is spoken. That is, it becomes a word. So the idea of ideas has become a word, the logos. We should immediately recognize here the passage from the famous prologue to the Gospel of St. John. And the word, logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. So many implications in that, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the minute you say word and spoken, you've introduced physics into the equation, sound, frequency, etc. The logos, the principle of creative reason, is the generative principle behind the world of ideas. In turn, the logos gives rise to the logoi, spermatikoi, the seeds of the logos, which Philo describes as the seminal reason principles by which the ideas of the intelligible world are realized. The Trinity that Philo thus suggests is as follows. God, the logos, and the logoi spermatikoi, or the ideas. Philo's God is utterly transcendent, and in that sense, it is the most generic of all. God is unnameable, unutterable, and absolutely without any predicates. Those initiated into the true mysteries of the existent, wrote Philo, with a generously gifted nature and education, are those who do not attribute to God any properties of a created being. Wrote Philo, the most generic is God, and next to him is the logos of God, but all other things have an existence only in word. The logos of God is above the world and is eldest and most generic of created things. And, concludes Philo in the passage quoted above, there also exists the particular intellectually perceptible as a simple generic idea. These are the logoi spermatikoi. In a passage of the Allegories, Philo comes close to naming the Trinity of the Christians, God, Son, and Spirit. He first cites the passage in Genesis where God shapes Adam from a lump of clay and then breathes into his face the breath of life. Says Philo, now that which breathes in is God, and that which receives what is breathed in is the mind, and that which is breathed in is the spirit. What then is collected from these three things? A union of the three takes place. Hence the Trinity. From another direction, Philo approaches the same problem by asserting that God exists in a Trinity with his two chief powers, the creative power and the regal power. The latter, that which administers the world, and the former, that which creates it. By calling the creative power God, he allows the supreme being to remain unnamed, calling him only he that is, ho on. On either side of him are the most senior powers, the nearest to him the creative and the regal. The title of the former is God, Theos, since it made and ordered the universe. The title of the latter is Lord, Kyrios, since it is the fundamental right of the maker to rule and control what he has brought into being. Then Philo describes how the three, he that is, God, Lord, appear as sometimes three, sometimes one, depending on the state of the beholder. So the central being, attended by each of his powers, presents to the mind which has vision, the appearance sometimes of one, sometimes of three. Of one, when that mind is highly purified and passing not merely beyond the multiplicity of other numbers, but even beyond the dyad which is next to the monad, presses on to the ideal form which is free from mixture and complexity, and being self-contained needs nothing more. Of three, when as yet uninitiated into the highest mysteries, is still a votary only of the minor rites and unable to apprehend the existent alone by itself and apart from all else, but only through its actions as either creative or ruling. This, as they say, is a second best voyage. Now we must consider here in preliminary form the conceptual foreshadowing in Philo of the Christian Trinity. For the movement of political Neoplatonists that was founded by Philo established its power of the myth of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Logos made flesh. In his essay on husbandry, Philo writes, for the land and water and air and fire and all plants and animals which are in these, whether mortal or divine, yes, and the sky, and the circuits of the sun and moon, and the revolutions and rhythmic movements of the other heavenly bodies, are like some flock under the hand of God, its king and shepherd. This hallowed flock he leads in accordance with right and law, setting over it his true logos and firstborn. Emphasis added. In describing the logos as the Son of God, Philo gave birth to the Christian idea. For the pagan, cult-worshipping masses of the Roman Empire, to the God-fearing but ill-informed Jewish urban dwellers, the notion of Jesus Christ as the embodiment of the universal Logos and Son of God inspired the movement that prevented the destruction of the world. Gee, can we have that whole paragraph in bold? I mean, there it is. Whole book pretty much encapsulated in one paragraph. I like that one. We have already noted that the process of creation or generation in Philo is analogous to the process by which an idea is realized or made potent in the production of the spoken word, logos of God. No longer does the idea of ideas reside only within God's mind. This process of real generation is also analogous to the human relationship between father and son. Christianity made creation the subject of the father-son idea. According to the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, a son is the product of the father, and the relationship between them is one of love. That love itself becomes a creative, generative force that produces what is called the Holy Spirit, which is the representation of the idea. Whereas the term God is often taken to mean the first person of the Trinity, in fact, the real Christian God is the sum of the three, embodied in the potent and productive relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There's another top paragraph. For Philo and the early Christians, the Trinity was a living concept. Stripped of its more mythological content, the Trinity is in fact no more than a highly effective and extraordinarily accurate heuristic representation of the inner workings of the human mind. It is the means by which the Platonic hypothesis of the higher hypothesis is communicated to the intellectually starved masses of the empire. In the Trinity, God is used to represent the mind itself. Inside that mind, the Father represents the thinking, creative knower, the I of the mind. In one sense, when one uses the term I to refer to oneself, it is this knower that is referred to. Now, when the mind thinks about itself, using itself to study the workings of the creative mind, then the knower becomes at the same time the known. That is, the thou of the mind is the mirror against which the I tests its thought processes, its hypothesis forming processes, in order to achieve reason and scientific certainty. Then in the dialogue between the I and the thou, between the Father and the Son, knowledge is generated. In this sense, the real I, with which each of us identifies when we refer to ourselves, is the unity of the three, the knower, the known, and the knowledge. That is the meaning of the Christian Trinity, God. The meaning of the Christian Trinity God. The epistemological clarity and revolutionary ideas of Rabbi Philo Judaeus, grasped and forged into the weapons of battle by Jesus Christ and the early Christian church fathers, proved their validity by the only true test. They engaged and defeated the best organized force for evil in the history of mankind, up until now, namely the Roman Empire. In what follows, that story will be told. It is a true story. It is a story so filled with beauty and emotion that few human beings will be able to read it without tears of joy and sadness. Before we begin our story, however, a word must be said about the historical Jesus Christ. Aside from the indisputably authentic New Testament Gospels, virtually no written record of the life of Jesus Christ exists. No amount of modern scholarship and archaeology has been able to establish any more information about Jesus of Nazareth than what has been known to the world for centuries. Establishing a direct connection, then, between the work of Philo Judaeus and that of Jesus Christ and the apostles must necessarily be based on scanty evidence and recognition of the nearly identical content of the ideas. At present, it is impossible to answer the question, did Jesus know Philo?
Speaking of questions,
decades,
that we just covered really wonderful ideas that some folks might want to comment and question upon, or do you want to just keep going right along?
Yeah,
I
you know
want to
what?
go back
I
and
think
read a
that
couple of
you're
those
right.
paragraphs
You're right, Bruce.
again.
Yeah,
And there's just a couple of standout paragraphs in that last part, weren't there? Just a lot of things that tie together, a different way of describing the Trinity, for example. Not that much different, but different enough to open up a whole, set of ideas and connections. I love the history here. Brilliant.
but there might be things that are also problematic. I mean, what are your thoughts, Bruce?
Love is the creative force. I will be contemplating that every moment for the rest of my life, because I want to create a lot more things. I want to create a lot of different things. And by golly, I'm going to love what I want to create.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that idea makes it much more authentic. The idea of not just this passive God distantly, all powerful, lumbering over you as this force, but rather an active agency that has a similar type of relationship as a loving father should have to a son who is loved, and everything that comes out of that should really reflect in everything we do and create ourselves. So it's a fun idea. It's an important idea.
A thought.
Well, also briefly, really implied is we and everything we experience is a manifestation of that love, that power, that potential that has blossomed and appears as we are right now, and we can wield it quite intentionally. Sorry to whoever I interrupted there.
No, not a problem, Bruce. Matt Pete here. Hey, I see this as a real commandment to take the creative powers of love seriously and refrain from squandering it, because when we're creating, I see us doing what God is doing. And I want to share that when we refer to the loving relationship between a father and a son, I have in mind the relationship between Jesus and his earthly father, Joseph, who traditions say took in Mary, became her husband, even though he may not have had to have done that, and took Jesus in as his son, taught him his trade, and so that father love experience Jesus manifested in his life and in his teachings. I share that.
Nice. Ken, did you have a thought?
Yeah, could you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I'm not sure how far to go yet with the whole Trinitarian structure that we're starting to address here, but I do want to say that I'm very taken with the ongoing creativity part of this dialogue, and I wanted to bring people's attention back, whether you're in the Judeo-Christian tradition or not, to the point of God resting on the seventh day. I don't think we quite realize what it means to rest, but one does not rest in order not to get back up again and do something. Okay. So I just thought I'd point that out, that I do agree that I think this is in keeping with what probably was the original perception of an ongoing creative process in the universe.
Yeah, I've seen discussions on that idea of rest, and contemplation is perhaps the best conclusion that I would come to if I had to define what does it mean in that context. On the seventh day we rest. Contemplation comes to mind.
It's like it's like the God and is giving is the logos, the son. He's giving it. It's an act. It's an act. It's expansive. Logos is an expansive, not an emanation, but a direct relationship within the Trinity. I'm trying to understand it. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, I think it also helps to give more meaning to the people have an idea of, or a problem sometimes with the existence of evil that humans can do, and they're like, well, must God not also be evil, or how could there be a God if evil could exist? And it's like, well, at the same measure, if evil is caused by certain things that humans lack as far as knowledge of themselves, false passions that they've permitted to be cultivated inside of themselves, false ideas that they've chosen through their own will to be committed to, then you could say that erring, that falling off the path of goodness, is something that means that there must be a loving fatherly, like that fatherly love, or that type of parental relationship must also be there, because to be a good parent means you have to let your children have the freedom to screw up sometimes, and the faith to know that they'll eventually learn from their mistakes and errors, and you can't just force them to be perfect. You can't force them to be good, though you can give them all of the tools they need, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I see that
And
there's
there's-
two hands here. There's Bruce and there's Monty. I don't know who came up first.
Monty and Ken were before me.
Oh.
No, Ken is already gone.
Ah,
Do I have to take my own hand off once I
guess so.
speak?
I had a thought from before.
Unless
can't
you
just
want to be the
jump in,
Statue of
Pete.
Liberty,
You have a
Ken.
digital hand.
Sorry.
I didn't raise my hand, but I had a thought that I was from
All right, go
before that I wanted to offer.
Okay.
But also what you said, Matt, I was thinking about in terms of the question of evil. I mean, the idea of living in a fallen world and that God, you know, in the story allowed the snake into the garden, right? Like that's the quintessential idea for free will, that there is a choice. And the more I think about that, number one, free will is a discovery, right? And if we go back to, you know, the time of Christ, right? The question of free will is really not an obvious thing. And even in Greek tragedy, you kind of have it, but there's the fates as well. And, you know, you still the question of doing what's right, regardless of, you know, in spite of whatever the fates are, you know, that it's not just a question of doing whatever is good for you or is going to work out in your favor, but the idea of free will is, you know, like RFK and his, I think it was his interview with Joe Rogan. He used the story of Sisyphus, because he's punished by the gods, cursed by Hera, you know, he's stuck pushing the rock, but he still accepts his fate willingly, right? Instead, the alternative being to run from one's fate, to encounter a natural fate, just as a result of trying to avoid one's own natural destiny. So there's still that in like a limited sense free will with the Greek tragedy idea. But yeah, the discovery of free will is really something, it's a discovery, you know, that we can choose how much of the logos, if you will. Kuza says we can choose how much of God we allow into our lives. There's no really limit to that, but the free will is what decides how much of God we allow into our lives. But going back and therefore linked to the idea of the Trinity, right? Because I think this is where the bad guys get in, is the idea that there's just this abstraction, right? That God is just this sort of, the logos is just some distant abstraction. And the reason that people are so neurotic is because they're not embodied, right? They're not sort of listening to their own desires and their own individual identity. So everybody's just like a square, following laws, following rules. And so everybody's just neurotic, or as like R.D. Lang would put it, there's the divided self, which is a real thing, right? That you have a lot of this and then, you know, you just have this hypocritical society where everybody believes in these lofty ideals. Like that's the orthodoxy. That's the correct opinion that everybody should hold. But then in their private lives or whatnot, you know, there's the shadow, as Jung would say. So everybody has this shadow side. And because there are these high lofty ideals, which are considered sort of abstract and tyrannical, if you will, if you listen to a lot of the critics of Plato or Christianity, that's why people are sick, you know, because they're not embodied. But the real idea, right, I think, is that that's all a question of our epistemological level as well. Like the Christian idea of the logos is embodied as well. And that's why the Son is, you know, we're in the image of the Creator. So if we're in the image of the Creator and we're meant to imitate the logos made flesh, then naturally that means that every individual has a capax Dei, right? Has the capacity to act in the image of the Creator and therefore to do godly things, right? But does that mean the individual is God? No, right? And this is where you get the clash between the more orthodox idea and so they don't like the Renaissance, they don't like Prometheus, because that implies that man can become godlike. But if man is in the image of God, then surely he should be doing godly things, right? Not just earthly
Exactly.
things. And so that's how do you thread that needle? That's a question of one's epistemological development. At a certain level, there will always be the contradictories, the binds, right? That the shadow and the light, the Jungian shadow and the light, and all you can do is try and integrate the shadow. That's like the Luciferian synthesis, I think. But that's if we're just approaching it at the level of contradictories, rather than on the higher level, sort of the logos becoming embodied, right? And that's what love is. That's what this higher sense of love is, that our will, we willfully desire to become instruments of that higher good and to embody it and to act in the image of our loving Father.
So I don't mean to interrupt your flow, because that was so beautiful, but I was thinking that free will, I associate it in some ways with participation with Holy Spirit, which then ties into a larger understanding of or an experience of Creator.
I got a slightly
Yes.
different.
Hold on, Kelly, wait a minute.
I'm happy with that one, Nathan.
We had those are all wonderfully immortally good thoughts, and I appreciate all of them. But I just want to maintain, because there's a lot of us, and I know we all have thoughts we want to contribute. It's a very inspiring text, and thank you, Dave, for that composition. It's a really good high value thought. But Monty, I know you've been waiting, and Bruce and Peter have been waiting with their hands up. So Monty, did you want to speak still?
Yes, I missed last week. I did pick it up thereafter and republished the video, and I was a bit late today. I was had to go to the dark side, and I just got back to Mexico. So, any case, a couple of points. I mean, this is very close to my heart, and some of the research I've done. Term Lord, actually. Contemporary, it means one of authority, like, the British lords and all this on an earthly realm. But originally, it had to do with the idea of Yahweh or Jehovah, or basically the incarnation of God through a person on earth, which is really the point of the exercise. Insofar as the expression, the manifestation of the higher ideals, the breath, the word of life of God coming in through an incarnation in people. Now, normally we think traditional Christianity thinks in terms of, well, Jesus was Lord. And I guess, yeah, that would be an accurate statement in that, and so far as he represented a higher manifestation of a God on earth, and so far as that consciousness and expressing something. In other words, imago viva Dei, capax Dei, that the fulfillment of that. And thus, if you have, I think his intention was originally to uplift all the disciples to that level, for an incarnation, not just of one person, but a body of Christ on earth. And interestingly enough, I was actually kicked out of a theological school for the following proposition. I think there is reference in the Bible to this happening before. And I don't want to go too much into detail of it, but if you're familiar with the book of Job, he was cast down by God and got the plague and got this thing, it got ravished, and he was downtrodden, and he had three brothers, three people come to try and console him. But in the 32nd chapter of Job, there's a fellow that arrived named Elihu. And he presented his case. And from 32 to chapter 37, making very eloquent kind of points. But the interesting thing is it transfers from chapter 37, where it's still 32 to 37, Elihu speaking to these people. And then the 38th chapter begins with the following. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is it that gives counsel without knowledge? And the traditional view of this, the contemporary view, is all of a sudden a whirlwind came about, and the Lord came by from out of a whirlwind and spoke to these people. But the fact is, Elihu wasn't mentioned thereafter. And it's my proposition that in the case, what you're witnessing here is Elihu actually created a whirlwind of the mind where these guys were astounded. They couldn't answer him. And I believe in that 38th chapter is a recognition of a manifestation where they witnessed, where they had a realization of the actual incarnation of this idea of the Lord incarnate in flesh. I mean, they even go on to say such things as, you know, I've heard of you before, but now I see you with my eyes. And he spoke in very profound language. Like one of my favorite verses is, canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? And canst thou bind the dominion thereof in the earth? Now, of course, in this case, we don't understand, you know, but the first level of the first science is actually attributed to astronomy. And there were stories about the Pleiades being the emotional realm, Mazzaroth being the Holy Spirit. In other words, this is a language that was meaningful to them, which they knew about. So that's the point. I think it's worthwhile to maybe look further on and digest. But in light of that also, it was also my proposition that in relationship to Christianity, which I agree it has saved and brought forth Western civilization. But the counter to that is what I believe where the story has been subverted and twisted and mismanaged and translated. And I truly believe it has been the case. And it was translated to such a high degree that the biggest lie I think that's ever been told, and if we think about it just insofar as logic, if God is made up of love and truth and light, okay, and it is all loving and the desire is to build a kingdom of heaven on earth, the manifestation of that versus going to some afterlife. If that is the case, then I think the biggest lie that's ever been told and perpetuated from the story of Jesus Christ is that God ordained him to be sacrificed on a cross, to die for our sins.
But
It's
okay,
completely-
Monty,
Yeah.
Monty, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't want to undermine the flow of your thought, but you're raising like very massive theological issues right now that I don't want to necessarily have in the middle of the reading of the text, because a lot of these things are so big what you're saying that it almost like demands like an ongoing discussion about that. And we're in the middle of like, I just, you know, maybe we could have that after the reading is over.
To see it in light of what Philo is saying and what he's actually representing of what Lord means and God and the manifestation of God and the Trinity. So that's just in light of that. I didn't want to go further than that. So that's all I have to say.
Okay. No, that's good. I mean, you raised a lot of very, very, very high value points as well. No, thank you. Thank you. But would it be okay with folks if we proceeded onward for another 30 to 40 minutes of reading and then had open discussion after that? Or Peter, I know you've been waiting. Yeah, you're okay with that? Okay, cool. Kelly, you're okay with that? All right, thank you guys. All right, let's push on, because we're gonna get into some interesting work on the Essenes that I find a very, very interesting hypothesis.
Can I just make a quick comment here?
Kelly, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, since we're like continuing reading Philo here, I just thought maybe I like to raise the idea of like he's taken a lot of his stuff from Plato, and I just want to throw in the idea of Plato's geometry and like how we formed the circles, the triangles, and all that, and like how that might relate to the Trinity, how he got the idea of formulating that. And maybe that might that could help us in our further reading here.
Another way we can go about that one, if you like, Kelly, is you can go full on information science. bits and
Yeah.
pieces, if you like. If you think of the concept of the Trinity, which is at the origin cosmology stories of just about every mythology in the known to man. If you start with that infinite nothing and then circumscribe it into a circle, just visually, okay? So we've created a circle that represents, you know, the pre-universe, the primordial soup, however many descriptions you want to give it. When you cleave that, okay, draw a line, you know, a diameter basically, it would seem that you've split it into two, but in fact, you split it into three straight away. So you literally go from number 1 to number 3. You have a, let's say, an A and a B and the line that separates them, of which they both partake. Okay, so even though you've chopped it in half, for example, you still have the essence of the original creator contained within both halves. And it's that connection between the two, call it love if you like, Bruce, that connection between the two that continues thereafter. No matter how many times you cleave it, no matter how many times you differentiate from then on, everything participates in the original. And you can have a mathematical description of this, you know, based on topology. Maths of topology is the best that I've seen. It's just an interesting metaphor. It's saying much the same thing, but for me, in particular, it allows me to create some visual images in my head with which I have all of the philosophical associations that we've talked about over the last few months.
Yep.
Anyway, let me continue reading. Before we begin our story, however, a word must be said about the historical Jesus Christ. Aside from the indisputably authentic New Testament Gospels, virtually no written record of the life of Jesus Christ exists. No amount of modern scholarship and archaeology has been able to establish any more information about Jesus of Nazareth than what has been known to the world for centuries. Establishing a direct connection then between the work of Philo Judaeus and that of Jesus Christ and the apostles must necessarily be based on scanty evidence and recognition of the nearly identical content of the ideas. At present, it is impossible to answer the question, did Jesus know Philo? In recent decades, evidence has emerged that at least allows us to point in the direction of the answer. For the earth-shaking discovery in 1947 of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls has shed light on the existence and nature of a little-known Jewish sect in East Palestine called the Essenes. Although much of the evidence in these precious documents has been released to the public over 30 years after the discovery, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are still hidden from public view, and there is no guarantee that what has been released has not been altered or forged. The existence and study of the Dead Sea Scrolls was considered a matter of national security by the State of Israel, whose intelligence service, especially General Yigal Yadin, the well-known archaeologist who unearthed the Masada fortress as a symbol of Jewish suicide, has had charge of the scrolls since their discovery. Together with selected scholars from Oxford and Cambridge and the elite of the British oligarchy's Jerusalem aficionados, the Israelis have managed to keep a tight lid on the contents of these priceless documents. For instance, Professor Nachman Avigad of Hebrew University in Jerusalem is notorious for withholding precious funds from public scrutiny. Precious finds. The material from Cave 4 of the Dead Sea Scroll Archive have been totally suppressed for more than 25 years. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls shed light on the historical Jesus Christ? Do they or other documents provide insights into the background of the movement that came to be called Christianity? We do not know for sure. What evidence we now possess of the Essenes comes entirely from Philo, from the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, and from the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been made available. From the evidence, there is strong reason to conclude that John the Baptist was a member of the Essenes. John the Baptist is, according to the Gospels, the forerunner of Jesus of Nazareth, who announced the coming of the Messiah to the Jews of Palestine and who baptized Jesus in the waters of the River Jordan. From Philo's own testimony, he was aware of and looked favorably upon the Essenes. Philo reports that the Essenes are among the only bastions of virtue and philosophy in the East. Moreover, Palestine and Syria too are not barren of exemplary wisdom and virtue, which countries no slight portion of that most populous nation, the Jews, inhabits. There is a portion of that people called Essenes, in a number something more than 4,000 in my opinion, who derive their name from piety, though not according to any known form of the Grecian dialect, because they are above all men devoted to the service of God, not sacrificing living animals, but studying, rather to preserve their own minds in a state of holiness and purity. Philo concludes the treatise by noting that not even the barbarous frenzy of Rome was ever able to bring any accusation against the multitude of those called the Essenes. And he adds that the Essenes are a very model of a perfect and very happy life. Elsewhere, Philo wrote that our lawgiver Moses formed countless disciples into a fellowship called Essenes. According to evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes began as a sect approximately 125 years before Christ and existed continuously until the Jewish Wars of 68 AD. The scrolls themselves come from an ancient library belonging to a patristic brotherhood of Essenes at the desert village of Qumran. According to the scrolls, the brotherhood considered itself to be the one true representative of Judaism, accusing the dominant sects, including the Temple Sadducees, of faithlessness to the covenant of Israel. The Qumran Brotherhood described itself as the remnant of real Judaism that survived the immorality into which the Jewish tradition had fallen. The Qumran Brotherhood of Essenes believed that a savior or Messiah was soon to come who would end evil in the world and bring about a golden age in which the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord like the waters of the sea. They considered themselves an elect, whose task was to guard that tradition until the Messiah arrived. The Messiah, according to the scrolls, would take the form of the teacher of righteousness, who would destroy the false expositors who had, until then, perverted the Jewish heritage. Could Philo have seen in the Essenes a vehicle for transmitting his Neoplatonic message to the Jews of the Mediterranean? Isn't that an interesting description? Transmitting. Some would call it a conspiracy, and I'm being facetious there, folks. Did the Essenes or a part of them become the bearer of Philo's vision? Were they a secret society dedicated to spreading those ideas? The answers to these questions must remain speculative. What is known is that the Essenes were violently opposed to the infiltration of cult practices into the Jewish faith. This was occurring on a widespread basis through the urban centers of Hellenistic Judaism at the time. History records instances of Jewish leaders giving thanks to the gods Dionysus and Pan. There was a Jew who served as a guard at the temple of Serapis in Egypt, and another who made a seal upon which was inscribed the image of Heracles. In local synagogues, symbols and statues of the evil mystery religions gradually crept into use as objects of worship, as Jews accommodated themselves to local custom. And in Jerusalem itself, the Stoic sects of the Sadducees and Pharisees were thoroughly corrupted. The manuscripts of the Qumran Brotherhood of the Essenes reveal a deep commitment on their part to the destruction of the belief in magic, superstition, and Old Testament law on the part of the temple establishment. For instance, from the coming doom discovered at Qumran, there is this polemic against the temple Jews. They pay no heed to the hidden meanings of things, but divert themselves with all kinds of iniquitous arcane law. All who cling to rarefied arcane law will cease to exist. The world will be filled with knowledge and ignorance will cease to exist. The scrolls repeatedly refer to concepts which became the watchwords of the Christian New Testament. Terms such as the kingdom of God, the elect, and so forth are found repeatedly in the Qumran Brotherhood's works. Of course, the quality of thought that is found in Philo and in the early Christian writings is much more sophisticated than that contained in the Qumran documents. The message of Jesus as transmitted by the Gospels is far advanced in comparison with the more ritualistic and mystic Essenes. But Philo's praise of the Essenes as virtuous amid an otherwise barren landscape can only indicate that Philo saw the Essenes as an ally in his political fight to defeat the cults in the Roman Empire. Therefore, it can be hypothesized that John the Baptist, perhaps as an Essene or as a leader of a tendency within or related to the Essenes, was acting as a vehicle for Philo's humanist Jewish message. John the Baptist was born 6 months earlier than his cousin Jesus of Nazareth. Both were members of a family very likely to have had access to some vein of Platonic tradition. Around the year 28, John began his public ministry and built a mass following, baptizing with water those who sought forgiveness for their sins. John the Baptist's reputation was as an austere man who often went into the desert and who dressed in simple camel skin and ate locust beans and wild honey. Arrested and beheaded by Herod, John's death came very soon after he baptized Jesus. John recognized his role as messenger of the movement that Jesus would begin, and he put it this way: "He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now full. He must increase and I must decrease." Jesus' appraisal of John the Baptist made it clear that as great as John was, he was but the greatest of the prophets of the old order, which must now be replaced with the new order that Christ founded. Said Jesus, "I tell you, among those born of women, none is greater than John, yet he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he."
So now we have a choice. I didn't realize this section was going to end so quickly. We could either end the reading here and just open up for conversation, or read on for another 20, 30 minutes and then stop. It is obviously a convenient place to stop, but we could still read on. I don't know. What do people feel?
I think we should have conversation and
Okay.
start the
Yeah,
new
I have a
chapter.
there's a lot
question.
to
What do you guys think?
A lot to unpack.
Agreed. Yeah, there's definitely some pressing material off people's chests. I know. And I know Peter was waiting as well. He graciously pulled back before sharing a thought earlier on. And I know Kelly, I think he still had another follow-up thought. But Peter, did you?
Thanks, Matt. I'll share that in a reading, maybe a minute or two before the latest, we were talking about Jesus as Lord and Jesus in a relationship with disciples. We see it written, Jesus was exhorting his disciples and encouraging them to act as though they were going to do even greater deeds on earth than he had done himself. And we have an indication of that in the famous disciple of his, Doubting Thomas. Okay, why I think that Thomas got a bad rap by being called doubting, because in his name in 3 languages actually means twin, in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And there was a tradition that makes the case that Thomas was a spiritual equal to Jesus, or that he comprehended it, Jesus' service, ministry, and lessons better than any of the other disciples, or he got the spiritual message of it. So Jesus is telling us we can do even more than he's done. And so, at least on earth, in flesh and bones, and we can take that lesson and apply it.
How would you go if you turn that label, Doubting Thomas, into simply questioning Thomas?
Then I
He who
I
asks
accept that.
questions rather than just be doubtful, but somebody with an inquisitive mind.
I see Thomas as skeptical, as one who asks questions, like any good disciple of Socrates, and a good disciple of Jesus, who would interrogate the parables and ask questions, about seeing other folks doing good deeds. I mean, are they against us? Are they for us? How do we
I got a question for you, Peter. I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily put Thomas as something above or better than Jesus, but at the same measure, I don't know how to investigate Thomas's works much more than what I see in the Bible. But what else is there that helps us get glean a sense of what he did in his ministry in his time?
Yeah, if I may
I can
interrupt.
point to a couple things there. There is a Gospel of Thomas, and the Q Gospel, the Quella, which some have attributed as the source material even from Mark, and then some traditions, I wish I knew the precise sources, suggest that Thomas actually made it to India and founded a Christian colony in on the west coast of India. And the Portuguese explorers encountered them and they were marveled. They were amazed that there were people who knew about Christianity and were doing the things. And the one thing that perplexed the Portuguese the most was that these Christians in India had never heard of the Pope. So
News to me. Yeah.
yeah, that's all I can share.
No, that's fine. That's something to work with.
Probably to their advantage. Sorry again. I'm being facetious. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We got so Rick, Quan, Dave, Quan, I haven't heard you speak yet, and Rick either. So and Kelly, is your hand up from before, or is it still something you have a new thought you want to share? Okay, well, let's go with I saw Rick and then Quan, and then we'll go to Dave. So Rick.
Yeah, sorry. It's good. Hello, everybody. It's good to. Can you hear me? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. I missed part of this because this is around in California at 6 o'clock, so it's usually around dinner time. I have to go and do that. But I got the first part of the reading, and when Philo talks about, or in the article talks about, a nation, get rising above a petty nation state, and or nationalism not being based on race and ethnicity, but on a higher concept. And I think about when Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He had basically abstracted himself from by doing that, by saying that, he abstracted himself from any kind of allegiance to just the Jewish nation. They said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he punched Pilate. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And when Peter when Peter cut the Roman's ear off at Jesus' arrest, the reason why Jesus was able to restore the ear of the Roman soldier is because he was ascribing to a higher ideal of it's kind of like Plato's cave, rather than just looking at the figures on the wall, being able to go outside the cave and stay and get a bird's eye view and look at all of humanity as a whole and rise above just your tribal ethnicity. And when I think about that, I think about there's a lot of debate and argument today about, are we in the end times, and people going back and forth comparing Donald Trump to Jesus Christ. And, I think about if there is an American Jesus, it would be Martin Luther King Jr., because he was in a very similar position as Jesus, being that Judea was like an oppressed nation state. It was a victim. It was colonized, and occupied. It was a lot like these African countries today that they have puppet leaders. Like Herod was a puppet of Rome and all this stuff. And so MLK was he had foreseen his death. He had his Last Supper moment. He had written about and talked about that he was probably going to die, and that reminds me a lot of Jesus. And he was caught between the zealots, the black zealots, the separatists who hated all white people, and the white power structure, which is that's like Rome, and the black people in America in the 60s are like to Judea in the first century. So you can kind of draw the comparison. That's how, if there is any American Jesus figure that comes close to that, it would be MLK. But I think a lot of fundamentalist Christians, they get so caught up in worshiping Jesus and that you have to be saved, and that they forget the message, I think.
He definitely walked the walk, that's for sure. He didn't hide behind the Bible as an excuse to not take responsibility, that's for sure. No, you're good observations.
Thank you.
Yeah, Quan, man. Quan, I haven't heard you speak today.
Yeah, I think that Peter mentioned quite rightly the Gospel of Thomas, okay, because bear with me, I want to read the beginning of the Gospel because it's truly the center of what we're discussing tonight. So the disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what heaven's rule is like. So, and what is the law of heaven?" And precisely, Jesus Christ answered that the kingdom of heaven is like the smallest of the seed, like the mustard seed. And that is the metaphor for the epistemological development precisely. Because let's not forget that in the gospel, at the beginning of the Gospel of John, it's said that Logos at the beginning was Logos, and Logos was with God, and that Logos is God. Okay, so at the beginning doesn't mean at the beginning in the chronological sense of the word. At the beginning means in the timeless reality, and in the timeless reality meaning at the source, and that's the word that was with God, meaning that the human being or the potentiality of his mind as capax Dei is capable to enter the epistemological journey. And after that, that the word is God, that meaning that he would achieve his epistemological journey. And I want to take maybe not 5 seconds, but 3 minutes to read the first paragraph of the Gospel of Thomas, because I think it's really the equivalent, I would almost said, of the chapter 7 of the Republic, meaning the allegory of the cave, which is one of the most powerful metaphor for the epistemological development. So here is the beginning of the Gospel of the Mustard Seed by Thomas. They are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Jesus said, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled, and he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will roam over the all. Meaning, once again, one of the many is being in union with the one. Jesus said, if those who lead you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. And if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. Jesus said, the man old in days will not hesitate to ask a small child 7 days old about the place of life, and he will live. For many who are first will become last, and they will become one and the same. And my last paragraph, Jesus said, recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you, for there is nothing hidden which will not become manifest. Okay, so I think that the Gospel of the Mustard Seed is the perfect equivalent of the allegory of the cave from the Republic. And I did not read the whole Gospel, of course, but if you read the whole Gospel, you would have step by step the epistemological development as explained in the Christian tradition, because once again, the big revolution from Philo is truly to introduce the psychocosmogram, okay? Because once again, cosmos is not the external physical universe. Cosmos is God's plan. And the epistemological development will allow the human being going into that epistemological journey to reach to the state of dialecticon, if I use a Platonic terminology, and of theoria episteme, meaning direct contemplation of reality. And that is precisely the program or the plan of the Gospel of Thomas, of Gospel of the Mustard Seed. I stop here because maybe we should read the Gospel of the Mustard Seed one day.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I got I as you were talking, I ordered the Gospel of Thomas on Amazon and a few other things. So this is very interesting. And it says here that it was discovered with the Nag Hammadi texts, but it's a little bit it's apparently the one that's not too Gnostic apparently in its tone. I'm curious because anytime I see a lot of the the apocryphal Gnostic text, I get a little bit like antsy, but and it,
Wow,
a lot of
the
stuff
problem,
huh?
I would say that here we have a problem of lexicon, okay, because the word Gnostic or gnosis has been so much associated with the shenanigans of Aleister Crowley or of all that gang, that let's not forget that gnosis is simply the Greek word for knowledge, okay? So it's almost an equivalent of episteme, theoria episteme, meaning direct perception of the timeless reality.
Right. And I guess you got
So
the difference between the lawful gnosis and the unlawful gnosis, whereas the one is actually embedded as part of or created as part of an initiatory process into evil, whereas the other one masquerading as good and the other one actually is good.
absolutely,
So
absolutely.
differentiate that.
The people who fake those stuff, they are not idiots, okay? They are at least at the level of intellect, of psyche, okay? They know how to fake stuff.
Yeah.
And the best way to produce shenanigans is precisely to imitate as closely as possible the true teaching, because you have a power in the words of the true teaching, and the people wanting to mesmerize the general population would use a lexicon that is very close to the true teaching because they want to take the prestige from the true teaching precisely.
Absolutely. Dave, did you still have that thought you wanted to throw out there?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask a nerdy question, but on the issue that Quan brought up, I mean, there's a natural thought that comes to mind as well, because I've been thinking about Gnostic cults and the bad guys and all that. But yeah, I mean, the idea I think is, and Jay Dyer, I mean, I feel like this is the kind of thing that he talks about as well. Gnosis is like secret knowledge, right? Because what are mystery cults, right? Is that there's a secret knowledge, and in the Christian tradition, the idea is that actually no, like everybody can have a direct relationship with God. It's not with the logos. It's not something that needs to be mediated by some secret priesthood, actually, but everybody can actually develop a serious relationship with God, and that's actually their duty to cultivate that in themselves. So I guess the gnosis, the psyop, is how we treat the question of mystery, in the sense that there are mysteries, right? There is a mystery of the soul. The mystery being perhaps that these things exist, right? That ideas exist, that creativity exists, that we're not just flesh and blood, and that there's a higher transcendent reality that we all have access to. But that's the mystery that it is. And the way the bad guys obscure this is where is the emphasis, right, on the mystery? Like, what do we mystify and what is made clear? And so we have the same thing in mysticism, right? You have like the occult sort of Gnostic mysticism, where what is the idea of mysticism? It's in the name, mist. So when you're ascending into a higher spiritual realm, Kuza talks about this in his vision of God. He says that to go beyond the wall of paradise, right, to actually have a vision of God, you have to go beyond the vision of the flesh, beyond any sort of comparative knowledge, such that the absolute and divine eternal light will not actually be bright. It'll actually be complete darkness, because anything that could be assessed in terms of brightness means it could still be more or less bright. So naturally, the brightest light has to be absolute darkness. And so this is where you get this idea of like of mystery, right? That when you come to know God, it's not, you come to know the mysteries, right? To see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And the more you know that, the more the mysteries become clear. And the bad guys want to, there's a million different ways to subvert that, right? Like, how do you tap into the mysteries and follow your intuition and, where your senses and feeling are sort of substituted as intuition, as pure sense perception. You know, we were talking about like the Mormons. I was talking about talking to the Mormon kids. There's a Mormon church in my neighborhood. Great kids, you know. I like the Mormon kids. They're good kids. But you know, when I ask, like, how do you know God, right? Because if there's this Church of Latter-day Saints and there's new saints coming up with updates, how do we know it's true? And he said, when God speaks to us through our spirit. And so when God speaks to us, you'll feel that it's true. You can feel that it's true. And that's the sleight of hand, where if we feel something is true, then it must be true. And I just shot back that, well, hang on a second. There's a million people that feel that what they think is true. They feel it's true, and so they think it's true, but it's not. And that's how cults are created, right? You just use feeling. So you can't just rely on feeling. But I think, yeah, that's just one example of using the idea of mystery and gnosis and like intuition, and depending on how you present it and what the practices are, you can subvert the idea of true knowledge of God, which is still mystery and which is still darkness in a sense, right? You're still beyond the wall of paradise. You're not seeing things directly, but it's becoming learned in our ignorance, right? In the more we come to know these mysteries, the more learned we become in our ignorance, and everything else becomes detail.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dave. And I mean, I was just thinking on that issue of the fact that we have these different attributes of faith, of feelings, like this sense in our gut. But these things, these are wonderful. Like, there's the source of insight, of inspiration. You know, you require these things, but if you have it unbounded from any guidance by reason, so it becomes severed. Like, we become a severed, divided self, where our reason is not mediating or is not active in moderating the and working with our feelings. We can really become manipulated and go off track and self-deceive. So a lot of these people who want to be spiritual, I've noticed, especially amongst the New Age and the New Agey different expressions of Christianity and other religions, right? There's New Age takes on a variety of forms, but a lot of them, they love the feeling of that direct experience of what they feel deeply inside as God, but they've not worked on their minds at all. Like, they actually think that, if anything, that their mind is something that is not all that valuable. Or you know, if we try to understand or discover something of God's creation, it's like we almost sin, or we go off track, because that creates pride, and pride is evil. So we should just like focus on the faith side of things. And then again, people just get really screwed up with this stuff. So to have them both work together is high value. Not enough people do it. But I see that there's a lot of hands still. There's Ken, there's Susie, there's Kelly, there's Quan. Quan, are you still, is your hand up from before, or did you raise it again?
I raise it again, so I will wait for my turn.
Okay. All right. Well, Kelly, I know you've been waiting for a while, man. Did you want to?
Yeah. This Philo, he was there during the time when all this stuff was going on, and you know, when the Bible was being formed, when they're doing the arguments, so all this stuff's going on, and obviously he's very knowledgeable with like all of Plato's works. Mm-hmm. And yet he's Jewish. He's very knowledgeable of the Pentateuch and all that, which, because that was written during that time. I guess the Bible wasn't written, like he took part.
No, well, the Pentateuch had been written already for a long time before.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It was written, so he's like trying to interpret what he knows about Plato, and he's trying to render stuff out of the Pentateuch. And then during all that, we have the Jesus thing going on, and he even starts formulating this idea of the Trinity. And I'd like to know more about that, like if there was more historical records, like what he actually did to like just during this beginning of the whole Christian thing, I find it fascinating. And yeah, so yeah, it just got me going with because Plato's teaching about like geometry and like pure like that epistemological like really basic philosophy stuff, and he's kind of putting it all in, and yeah, I don't know where to go with this.
Yeah.
Like
Well, you're
how
going to
did
find out a lot more of the story. The story is going to unpack in Philo's role within the geopolitical terrain of Rome will be developed a lot more in next week's reading.
yeah,
So,
like I've been kind of trying to study this for quite a while, and it's just great that you picked this topic. It's starting to answer a lot of questions, and as well as the Gospel of Thomas. I've known about that. I have the book here, and even that, it wasn't like, as far as I know, they didn't have that gospel when they were deciding which books were going to go in the Bible. Apparently, that it was already lost, and I'm just wondering if they had it at the time. It's very possible they could have included it in our today's Bible.
got to look into it more. Yeah, I don't know what those debates were.
I'm just suggesting. I have no idea.
Susie, did you let's do Susie, then Ken. I think I've caught everybody, and then Quan. So Susie,
My mind is so full of so many ideas. I hope I can bring one or two of them out. I just love what Quan describes about epistemological growth. And I can remember when I first came into these lectures, we were having some discussion about learning. And I talked about how I had to go through that with my kids when I was teaching them to read. I didn't even know what that look-say method was because I had learned phonics. And then I realized they were just teaching the kids to memorize words. And it's much easier to memorize than it is to learn. And then Quan asked me what the word was for what I was describing. And I'm like, I don't know. And that's when he said, that's epistemology. We all tend to avoid doing the hard work of growing, but that's what's necessary. And in one of these discussions of the stages of epistemological growth, Quan talks about being stuck at that stage where you're relying on the opinion of the experts. And that's what too much of religion has brought us into, is that you're supposed to rely on the opinion of the experts and what they say about God. But too often, the experts in our midst have not actually done the work of epistemological growth themselves. They've studied a lot and memorized a lot and stuffed their head with knowledge, but their heart is in a completely different place. But when we do the work of epistemological growth, we are becoming true. We are becoming perfected. And we do learn to know God along the way. And our hearts and minds are tuned to his truth. And we continue reaching towards more beauty, goodness, and truth. That's why I'm just so fascinated with Plato and everything you guys have discussed about him, because to me, it overlays perfectly with what I have learned is proper Christian growth. But more of that is done one-on-one, getting to know yourself and learning to hear God within yourself and what he is saying to you than it is learning from anybody else. So anyway, this Philo reading is amazing. I'm quite enjoying it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Here.
Amen.
Ken. So Ken, then Quan. Ken, are you? Did you still have a thought?
Yeah. Yeah, that was really beautiful. So I wanted to say, I wanted to comment quickly on three different things. To reinforce the point that Eli was making about Jesus's transnational mission, it's useful to look at the pericope where he is reading in the synagogue and the people get so pissed off at him. But the selections that he's taking are selections where God is actually intervening to help Gentiles. And so that has something to do with the anger that's aroused from his readings. Okay. The second thing I wanted to talk very briefly about the Thomas Gospel. And I know, Matthew, that you were commenting on this, but I lost connection at certain points. So I don't know how much you address this, but the interpolations by Gnostics in the Gospel of Thomas make it problematic. And yes, you can probably try to spin Gnosticism into a positive direction, but essentially we're talking about dualism and we're talking about, quasi-Manichaeism. So I would just caution people who are new to it to be careful in their reading of it. And then the third thing,
it's unfortunate you did drop off because we spent a sustained amount of time discussing that very topic.
Sorry.
There.
Okay.
No, it's not a problem. And I think that the key takeaway there is that when dealing with these questions, what's always important is to use our internal standard of judging what is a legitimate natural pathway of the mind being moved through ignorance into knowledge, through a process, right, that we can recognize because we've made discoveries ourselves. We know what our minds have done in that process of fruitful action versus a fallacious mode of composition, which acts like it brought you to some sort of secret knowledge or something, but without
secret
any
knowledge.
of the substance.
Yeah.
Right,
the secret knowledge, I think, is the distinguishing factor, and it's the one that provides continuity between the Gnosticism of the time and the secret societies of today. Okay,
exactly.
So caution people to be very
like we got to develop that internal compass for fallacies, fallacious compositions versus authentic or natural compositions that are reasonable. Very important distinction.
Right. And third, I just wanted to ask who it was. I didn't catch the name of the person who was talking about the sacrifice of Jesus as being inimical to a higher reading of Christianity, because I wanted to pursue that with that person, but I don't.
That was remember. Monty.
Monty?
Yeah.
Monte. Is there a way that he and I can connect outside of this?
Yep. Shoot him a message on in the chat box. Monty, you see Ken over there? You guys can send direct messages to each other.
Great. Thank you very much.
Quan?
Yes, I would like to come back to the notion of nosis as a legit knowledge versus the shenanigans of empire. I think that it can be quite complicated sometimes, and we have to explore that question deeply. But I think there are two criteria which might be very useful. The first criterion is political. Most of the time, when a Gnostic sect is promoted as a tool of empire, it would flatter the ego of the participant by proposing to them to be part of an inner circle, so-called inner circle having secret knowledge or superior knowledge. But it's only a flattery of their egos and not really a true epistemological journey to the higher kingdom. Okay, I would call it the political criterion. The other criterion, I call it the epistemological criterion, meaning that if you have a true journey into the epistemological journey, most of the time, you would have the integration of the animal kingdom and of the timeless reality, okay? And once again, I come back to the outstanding beginning of the Gospel of John, archelogos. Okay, logos was at the beginning in the timeless reality. Logos pros zoe. Okay, so logos was with God, and logos hoi zoe. Logos is God, meaning that the timeless reality is connected with the time reality. Okay, there is no non-integration, because most of the time in the Gnostic sects, which are shenanigans of empire, the person would be a fragmented. Okay, that person would have some bizarre things that he would think that comes from the timeless reality, but would still functions at the level of a sense of perception, intellect, and of the heart mind, which is the three layers of the mind at the level of the animal kingdom. And maybe one last comment in terms of vocabulary. There is a word which is arcane, okay, A-R-C-A-N-E, arcane, versus secret knowledge or occult. Okay, so I think that we have to be careful and distinguish between what is arcane and what was occult. Occult most of the time is associated with the shenanigans for empires. Arcane doesn't mean secret or hidden. It means it is open to you. It is open to your epistemological discovery. It is hidden if you don't make an effort. But if you make an effort in your epistemological evolution or in your epistemological journey, it would be no more hidden. And that is the true meaning of arcane. And in the legit gnosis, it is about the arcane knowledge and not about the occult knowledge. And I stop here.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about
I've
that.
always understood arcane to be associated with ancient.
It could be ancient, but it could be ancient. But
most of the call them occult textbooks, if you like, tarot, astrology, whatever, arcane was usually referred to in that sense as being ancient.
Yes, but that is a secondary meaning. The center meaning is truly.
I'll accept that. Yeah.
It is hidden if you don't make an effort to go to the upper reality.
Okay. Quan often talks about this attribute of playfulness. I finally got to the place in my life where I understood that my relationship with life and my relationship with God is supposed to be like an adventure and like a treasure hunt. And God is not hiding from us. He wants us to pursue the discovery and pursue growth and pursue truth and beauty and goodness.
Absolutely. And the aristocratic man, another way to name the aristocratic man is the cosmic man. Okay. And once again, cosmos is not the physical universe. It is God's plan in God's mind. Okay. That is the epistemological journey. Right. And I would like to say also that when I said the beginning of the Gospel of John in Greek of the time, in Hellenistic Greek, logos poros zoe, the word that has been translated in English as God, zoe, means at the first level, life.
Yeah, I that's interesting. Because yeah, that's the thing you tend to get from we had spent many weeks reading Kepler, and that also touched upon a little bit of work on Plato that we've done, but especially on Kepler, this idea that life itself exists because we participate in God, and that mind exists because there is the presence of God. But everything that has meaningful existence, purpose, design, which is all that is created, has that from its participation in God. So the fact that you have Philo also developing his cosmology with this it makes a lot of sense. And it's and that idea also that you see in the Republic where Plato is building up a city, right? To look, well, if it's difficult to find where justice is in an individual case, that's the problem with Thrasymachos in that first book of the Republic. It's difficult to like nail down, well, what is justice? We kind of see what it isn't, but we're having trouble seeing what it is just with this individual one-on-one interaction. Maybe we could see it better by taking a step back and looking at not an individual, but a whole city. Let's build up a city. And he actually builds up like a physical economy within book 2 of the Republic, right? And you're seeing that just like we are being put in a position where we're never going to see every element of a city physically with our eyes. we're seeing it with our mind's eye, how it evolves, right, in a process as well, not a snapshot, and all of the interconnections, the purpose of why things exist within the city. And then we'll maybe be able to like zero in on the question of what is justice. But that's exactly what we sort of just read from, and that's similar to God, right? And this idea that Philo was developing by building up his city in the selections that we had read from the creation and God's mind, how there's this metaphor that all of the universe is like a city of God in a sense that one can only access by being in that very creatively fruitful state of seeing with your mind's eye and not relying upon your senses for the truth. But then we can tap into that sense of God.
And what is precisely the first timeless form? Beauty. And justice is a consequence of beauty.
Right.
And that's part of the political criterion, okay, to distinguish the shenanigans of empire in the nosis or the legit nosis. Is that person going into that his epistemological development or growth with an idea of justice that everyone can be at God's image, okay? So you have the general attitude that would make the distinction between someone participating unwittingly to the shenanigans of empires or someone going truly into the epistemological journey or into gnosis, okay? Because let's not be afraid of the word gnosis. Gnosis simply means knowledge, okay? Or if you want, episteme.
Good point. So I noticed that there's Rick and Nathan wrote in the comments that he'd also like to share a thought. So Rick, why don't you go for it? And then Nathan can chime in.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wanted to say something about Quan's arcane versus occult. You know, and I just wanted to throw this out here as a possibility. Like, I was reading about how in the medieval ages, and you know, right up to like the Medicis and that time period, 1500s, 1400s, there was this view that so-called quote unquote Oriental knowledge or knowledge east of Christendom, like Islam, from Islam and China, was considered arcane. But like when you think about the limitations of the Roman numeral system for calculating, doing advanced math versus the Arabic numeral system, it was far superior. And so there was a lot of knowledge that I could see that there would be a lot of resistance in medieval Europe to these ideas coming from the East as being arcane, as conflating arcane with occult, right? That they're evil because they're non-Christian. And I could see that would cause a resistance to the idea of bringing in a lot of knowledge from, you know, like of better sciences and maths and overcoming. You know, one of the things I like to say is every culture has its Roman numeral. Every culture has its stopping point at which you have to bring in concepts from outside, a new idea. So anyway, that's just my thought. What do you think of that?
Yeah.
Very cosmopolitan thinking.
Well, definitely, yeah. Like we're no man is an island, no culture is an island either, and we're individually made better by cross-pollinating our thoughts and feelings with, but you know, in a social experience with other people, and so every culture would also benefit by not cloistering itself and isolating itself from the world around it, but by learning from others, right, and having the humility to see that okay, maybe I don't have all of the knowledge, and maybe I can benefit and learn from another culture who might have different words for things that I hold sacred, but we're all pursuing the ultimate same truths, which could obviously be abused. And we see the evil version of ecumenicism with Pope Francis and this whole, you know, find the worst elements of everybody and get us to have a big kumbaya.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah.
That does a lot of damage to the idea. But no. Nathan, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about Philo wrote in 325 BC, right? Around there. He was active then.
Philo,
right?
no, he lived
Philo of Alexandria
during the life of Christ, and then maybe 30
Okay,
years.
I'm totally off then. Yeah. So I misread that. Okay. So and then also Paul was contemporary with those times as well. And Paul came out of the Essene community. And if we
not Paul
didn't-
necessarily.
well,
I think he brought up John
you
the
think he-
Baptist as likely having emerged.
Yeah.
We don't know about Paul.
Okay, but he knew he had associations with some of the Essenes, you know, because
Paul was a long time later, wasn't he?
I don't know.
well, we have to get to the details of the history a little bit about when he lived and how, because the Essene community was very politically involved in wanting a Messiah, very much so. And then they wanted the Messiah to take revenge against the Romans. So they were in political revolt in that sense.
Yeah.
So there's a real narrative and a real story to understand how we look at this as knowledge and allegory and self-examination in terms of history. That was my only comment, really.
Okay, but wait a minute.
totally-
Paul was
Yeah.
Paul was a Pharisee. Where did he have interactions with the Essenes? Where have you read that?
I read a book called Paul to Mark, from Paul to Mark, and I read about the research in it regarding
Okay,
that.
I'll look that up.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't know if I may interrupt because to bring some historical elements about the Essenes.
Okay, go for it. I'm
Okay,
done.
because there's a character in the Essenes that is very important that is called the master of justice. Okay, and that master of justice is a kind of equivalent of the chief of the community of the Essenes, and that community started around, let's say, 200 BCE, because precisely in Jerusalem you have a hierarchy of hereditary priests who were at the same time the local nobility, controlling stuff, but from a mercantile perspective, if you want, okay? Because you know perfectly that when people go to Jerusalem to make the sacrifice, they have to pay a certain amount of money to the temple, and in that way that the temple will keep on functioning. And it was a kind of bank at the same time. So it was a little bit a smaller replica of the Babylonian functioning of the state, if you want. And those Essenes precisely were people who were not very happy with that transformation of Jerusalem into a new Babylon. And they went into the desert to keep the doctrine or the epistemological growth, if I may say so, intact. Okay, and Jesus Christ, and I read a lot about the Essenes in the past, and I'm quite in favor of Dreyfus' interpretation of the Essenes as being the stream having kept the purity of the original Judaisms, and those people were not happy with what is happening with the hereditary nobility controlling Jerusalem, and that most probably Jesus Christ receive their teaching in his youth.
Okay. Question, Quan. Since you've looked undoubtedly much more at this than I have on the Essenes, have you noticed a connection to the Pythagoreans?
Absolutely, because Pythagoras was a kind of patron saint of the scientific thinking at the time. Okay, so once again, let's not forget that Pythagoras died in 495 BCE. So of course, at the time of the Essenes, Pythagoras has not been forgotten, and they kept on what was considered as the treasure trove of science within the Mediterranean world of the time. And let's not forget that Archimedes died around 273 BCE, okay? So all that dynamism of Greek thinking, of Greek discovery and dynamic mind adventure kept on. And the people in what we call the Levant nowadays were not ignorant of that Greek adventure, because if you look at the map of Israel at the time of Jesus, you have a stuff called Decapolis, okay? So you have 10 cities with Greek name on the eastern side of Galilee. And many authors thought that Jesus not only had the legacy of the Essenes, but also the legacy of the Greek philosopher through the people living in the Decapolis, the 10 city with Greek names and Greek culture.
Interesting. Very interesting. Dave, actually, no, first, Peter, I know you wrote something in there. Did you want to also say a few words on top of your Dorian Gray thought? Oh, you're on mute, by the way. You're on mute. I don't know why you're
Wait, did you call me?
No, I noticed you said something, but also Peter said something right before you, so I called Peter first.
Oh,
and then
okay.
Yeah, here I am.
your question can come up.
You're definitely on deck, David, subject to Matt. So I was thinking about, okay, that Dorian Gray, written in the 19th century, may have been an illusion, may have been an allegory of an illusion of beauty, an illusion of truth, illusion of what's real. And what was actually real was hidden in his attic. I was just thinking about that. But when it came, but I raised my hand over the Essenes because I have read that some have read that story about Paul being struck blind on the road to Damascus, that Damascus was actually a code word for the Essene camp, Qumran.
Really?
I'd share the source if I knew it right off the top of my head. And the Essenes did start, as Quanley, as I understand it, and as Quanley explained, about 200 BCE. So they were gathering, and they were still in existence during the Common Era, and they were trying to get away from what had happened in Jerusalem in the wake of the Hasmonean dynasty, and then the influence that Rome gained and increased, in those decades before the Common Era, and that it did not, and they certainly objected to the use of the temple as the source of selling indulgences at the same time that they were paying taxes. And that's the reason why Jesus took a scourge and whipped the money changers, because they were using the temple to subjugate the people unto Rome. And he said, that's not, I'm not about that. And then there was a earlier reference to Jesus' first appearance in a synagogue, and he quoted a portion of Isaiah that addressed the releasing of debtors. And that created a controversy because, the Rabbi Hillel, who had quite a following in those days, devised an instrument to get around the Jubilee. And that worked to the benefit of creditors. And of course, Rome's laws had a firm foundation, and debt is king. If you're a creditor, you're the king of the world. And if they don't pay, you take over their properties. And Jesus said, no, we got a Jubilee here. And that's written right smack in the middle of the Torah. And we got to honor that. And the Essenes did honor that. And the folks in the synagogue did not like what Jesus was saying.
Can you remind me, Peter, what section of the Torah is touched on the Jubilee?
That's Leviticus 25:10. Leviticus 25:10. Proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. And a couple of things. Number one, you'll find that inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. And because of that, that's the last thing that Charlton Heston said portraying Moses in the Ten Commandments.
That's funny.
That's memorable.
Aye.
Yeah.
No,
I'll save that for a trivia quiz.
No, that's very important. Dave, did you still want to ask the nerdy question, or just leave it for the chat box?
What about Da Vinci's painting of Saint John the Baptist? Any thoughts?
Do you have a more specific framing of that question?
No, I don't, he's pointing upwards. And so the one thing I heard, I forget where I heard that. I don't know if it was Carell, but something about are you going to the kingdom of heaven or not? Just Saint John the Baptist was technically, I don't know, was he theologically he wasn't able to go yet because I don't think Jesus had died yet. So is he still going or not? I don't know. Is that what the controversy is about? I mean,
I know there's
a
one
compelling
controversy
painting.
that stems from Sigmund Freud, who had some analysis that this was
yeah, not that.
No, not the hermaphroditic like John looks kind of like effeminate, and so that's coming out of the
they all look effeminate.
No, but
Donatello's, they all look. Shame on you for bringing that up. Shame.
No, but gentlemen, I think that there is a higher interpretation of that.
As always.
So, because if you, I don't know if you remember the painting, all of you, but that in that painting, Saint John is emerging from darkness, okay, because it's the technique of chiaroscuro. So you have the flesh of the young Saint John at the forefront, which is light, and at the back you have darkness. So the higher interpretation would be that you have a Saint John emerging from darkness, which is precisely the simultaneous presence of the spirit and of the flesh, and that the grace of Saint John's precisely of physical beauty can be interpreted as erotic, but also can be interpreted as a spiritual meaning, in the sense that he embodied the fullness of the grace from God.
Well, he's pointing to himself and he's pointing to heaven with a bit of a confident smile to the audience. What do you think, Dave? I mean, what I appreciate your analysis, Kwan.
I'm literally asking. I don't know.
Literally, okay. I thought you had.
It was a nerdy question. I wanted to know.
I
hadn't thought about that.
It's not a nerdy question because it's the younger Plato in the painting of Raphael showing the heaven, but this one is much younger than Leonardo impersonating Plato in Raphael's painting.
But technically, is John able to go to the king? Because then he died before Jesus did, right? So would he technically be allowed into the kingdom of heaven?
I would say yes. I mean, if that's the joke, if there's a bit of a subtle playfulness in Da Vinci's tone, and Da Vinci's very playful, based on if that was really a big controversy back then, I would say probably, yeah, that means like he's very clearly saying, like he's pointing to himself, pointing to heaven, smiling at the audience. And if there's a big controversy about him dying before Christ did, and thus he's not in heaven, I think that's probably cheeky way of saying, yeah, it's, yes, he was a good person.
Yeah, and I would be very shocked if someone like Plato or Parmenides or Archimedes or Solon or all those people did not go to heaven. Okay, so I think let's be careful not to be too religiously dogmatic and interpreting heaven in a very narrow sense.
Yes,
take it up with Dante.
Yeah.
See, this is why I said it was a nerdy question. I just wanted to see what people.
I'm shocked, David. You're not a nerd. What happened tonight?
No, I've seen the picture. We're talking about Saint John the Baptist. I was finally, wanted to get some thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, I have some. I want to add something because I think there's a link to some of the thing. Well, to the main theme of the thing we read tonight, meaning the logos or the Trinity, right? Because when he's pointing to himself, I think we have to look at where he's pointing. He's pointing to his heart, right? And the heart is often associated with sensations, right? So you have the sense perception. When he's pointing upward, he's pointing to heaven. So he's pointing to the world of ideas. And I think that the cross that he's holding between the heaven and his heart, or you could say is the earth, is maybe the Holy Spirit, what links both, or what links knowledge, or I would say what was it said in the text, the known and the knower, or something like this. So I think that there's of course a lot of interpretation that can be made here, but I see the Trinity in the symbolism of the hands, and there's also this smirk, like in his smile, like he's he knows something, or he, is not hiding something, but there's
Yeah,
a smirk, like a certain
yeah,
playfulness.
yeah. Like there's something being said that's not spoken. But I think what you just said, Kevin, like yeah, and somebody wrote this in the Kelly wrote as above, so as below. But I mean, I think it's very clear with the cross being positioned exactly where it is. That's not a coincidence. Nothing is ever a coincidence in a Da Vinci composition. No, I mean, I think he's certainly pointing to the Father, God, all in, like this thing outside of the framing of the painting. It's something you can't contain within the painting, but it's partially the subject of the painting. To then himself, it's a direct link, and this idea of the cross comes with it a definite sense of the passion of Christ, the love that Christ had for humankind, that he was willing to go through what he went through. I think that's a very, very powerful message.
Wow.
I don't think it's a
Something else I want to add. It's been gnawing at my mind since since pretty much the beginning of this lecture. I just want to throw it out there because I don't know how to make sense really of it. But in the text we read that in the beginning God created the idea of ideas, right? Or he also sometimes he seemed to equate that also with the concept of mind, right? And out of the mind, ideas actualize in the sensible world. So the way I kind of shorten it is that you have the world of ideas, and from that you actualize ideas into the real world. But this concept in itself is an idea, and it's almost as if Jesus is the actualization in the sense of in the world of senses of the idea of the actualization of ideas. There's a kind of infinite loop going on in that. I don't know how to put it, but it's I had to throw it out there, and I kind of see that in the painting also.
Potent thought. Good.
Yeah.
Monty.
Yeah, I like Kwan's feedback on this just because he seems to has a very appreciation of really understanding culture and history to really, in reading things from the past, presently, to have a right interpretation of them. And in light of that, many, many years ago, I attended some lectures on an associate of a man named George Lamsa, who actually wrote a Bible back in 1935, a direct translation from Aramaic to English rather than going through the other translations, which was very interesting. I happen to have that Bible, and it's a good study. But in the course of his lectures, he was telling stories about understanding that culture, really to understand the parables of the time. And one example he gave was of Jesus feeding the 5,000 from the mountaintop, right? They were all gathered together, and the 5,000 out there. He took loaves and fishes, and magically it fed these 5,000 people. In other words, kind of an idea that he's supernatural natural powers or otherworldly. We can't attain that. These miracles, somewhat like aliens today in a way. And the way Dr. Rico Errico explained this, he's from that region and really understood the culture. It's somewhat like if someone today came into our culture and didn't really understand transportation and airplanes and the postal service and how things work. If we put a letter in a mailbox and magically it arrived all the way across the world the next day, it would be looked, well, that's a miracle. And in point of fact, he said what happened is when people came to these gatherings, they hung loaves and fishes beneath their robes. And by the act of Jesus and the disciples passing out their loaves and fishes, it simply inspired them to feed the masses. So I like Kwan's comment on that because I think it applies to a lot insofar as understanding history and culture of the times to really get an interpretation of today of the reality of what was happening back then, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think it's useful. Like a lot of people, I think they latch on a little bit too much to the supernatural miracle aspect of the stories of Christ, and they forget the revolutionary moral qualities that they could learn from, and then they sort of turn off to the type of story we're reading about and talking about today, which involved universal history and the taking down of the most evil consolidated global empire through the advent of this revolution in epistemology and loving and agapic love as a movement, and that people lose that. So that interpretation is very attractive to me. I like that, and it still carries a moral. It's not to undermine the story; it also carries a very moral lesson within it as well, which I also like. So yeah, I've always had a problem too with the idea of turning a couple of loaves and some fish into 5,000 through a supernatural event. It's a bit, yeah. I like the reasonable approach. Rick.
Oh well, yeah. I think it could be an allegory for science, though, or using creativity to teaching. Like for example, instead of just giving someone a fish, teaching them how to fish. Or I think that I look at the multiplication of the loaves of fish or the loaves of bread and the fish as a allegory for the overcoming the limits to growth. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't know what other people think of that. I mean, I personally think if you think about it within the context of the sermon that Christ is delivering with all of its universal bombshell messages, right? That these are transformative lessons that if people learn from, they will be infinitely more productive coming out of that experience for the rest of their lives than they were going into it. So yeah, in that sense, the replication of loaves and fish has a wonderful metaphorical idea to it.
Yeah, because what do they always tell you? What do the skeptics always tell you? Oh, you can't get energy from nothing, right? Or the whole perpetual motion. They always they throw the wet blanket at you when you talk about 0-point energy or cold fusion or something like that. They call it quackery, right? Oh, you can't get something from nothing, but they forget that there's a unlimited source of energy coming from outside. It's not in an open system. You have energy coming from outside. In a closed system, it works, thermodynamics, but in an open system. So the idea, Jesus manifests these fish and loaves of bread from nothing, but that's like it's taking energy from the ether, right? Because food comes from energy. It comes from, you desalinate water to grow food, or you you use nuclear power to do that, or other newer forms of energy. And they're talking about getting energy from the vacuum of space. There's a big debate about that right now. So, your faith, the faith that you can, the faith that Jesus talked about, I think there's a scientific faith or faith that you can overcome the limitations that we currently have, that new innovations can come online to where we probably could draw energy out of the quantum vacuum or 0-point or something like that, with new innovation. Like I saw this guy named Garrett Modell who used the Casimir cavity or Casimir plates, and he restricted wavelengths in one direction, and was able to extract energy from the 0-point field, and he's able to prove it over and over again, a small amount of current from it.
Yeah, man. Rick, send me a link to that. I'm curious to see about this guy's work.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely don't want to limit our mind's sense of possibilities. We shut off that childlike wonder and the ability to make a new discovery, and keep the limits very, very constrained on the potential. So good points.
Thank you.
In terms of
Quan
new
had
discovery, Matt,
Yeah, Paul?
sorry, in terms of new discoveries, were you aware of what happened with the Sulfire project this week?
I got the update, but I haven't looked into it. What kind of
Okay, there's
announced?
a brief little video wherein they're they're moving ahead, etc. But they've managed to miniaturize the whole affair down to a tabletop size, and they hope their first application. They hope they're in discussions, partnerships, whatever already, with people who will use the technology for removing radiation from irradiated water. Let's say all of the wastewater coming out of Fukushima, for example.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's for them. It's not only verification of the technology, okay, plasma technology, essentially, but as a first use project, I mean,
yeah, to
let's
actually
be
find commercial
idealistic.
use for it.
Let's be idealistic and say who could be against it, for goodness sake. I mean, it's the perfect thing to have. There's a ready market for it, and apparently they're well on the way to let's say commercializing it.
Good, very good. That makes me happy. Cool.
I heard about a guy who had who's built a Faraday cage, and he's got and it's not a coil exactly, but he draws radio frequencies into the Faraday cage and is able to charge batteries, batteries, picking up the frequencies.
Yeah, there's a lot of wonderful discoveries off the beaten path, but we're all expected to stay within a little standard model, acceptable set of languages that denies all of this. That this is even possible.
Well, that's a fundamental reality that we're only just beginning to discover and to explore.
Yes.
99% of the universe is made up of plasma material, the fourth state of matter. Pretty much the entirety of our physics and science is based on the three states of matter.
Yep.
So it's the 1% of the reality that confronts us. We've got a lot to learn. We need to be a little bit humble.
Let's amen to that, brother.
Amen.
Let's do this. We're rounding out to 11 o'clock. Let's give Quan the last word to tonight's session.
Okay, I just want to say something very short, that a parable is a poem, and a poem is always an epistemological test, in the sense that when you read a parable, your interpretation would be the interpretation of your epistemological level. And when you have a miracle, for example, people not being in the divine kingdom will always go for the childish version of a miracle, rather than to see the true miracle, which is the possibility to go to the timeless reality precisely, and to be creative. That is the true miracle, and not the childish version.
Amen.
Amen. Guys, this is really great. Wonderful as always. So I'll catch everybody next week. For anybody listening online, you can review this, review the actual PDF text. It's in the description box. And this Sunday's class is going to be Promethean psychology. It's a friend of Cynthia and myself from LA named Bruce Lero. He's a psychologist, and he's somebody who's going to go through what the hell happened to the left, and he's going to introduce the Frankfurt School, wokeism. He himself identifies as a communist, but he is very, very angry that the 1950s, 60s genuine pro-labor communists have been completely they're gone now. It seems in the West, in America, and they're all nowadays you have to be a black bloc Antifa anarchist to somehow be qualified. So anyway, he's going to go through a lot of this history, and that'll be Sunday at 2 p.m. So otherwise, I'll see you guys either Sunday or next Wednesday. Good night.
See you on the flip side.
Good night. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Con.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.